Thank you very much, Dr. Isaacs, and I really enjoyed your small Freudian slip. Thank you very much, Doctors Masindi and Mugwenya, for being the examining panel today, and thank you to Dr. Tosin, my supervisor, for attending this session. And of course, a very big thank you to my colleagues from Da Vinci who are attending this presentation. The title of my presentation, which is the title of my thesis, and this has been slightly modified since the proposal, is a conceptual business incubator framework for junior mineral exploration and development in a South African perspective. My presentation is going to be following 4 major sections. And as Dr. Isaac said, yes, this is primarily focused on the literature review, which is part 2, and part 3 being the research methodology. But as we have maybe a slightly new panel and maybe new colleagues from Da Vinci, there is a part 1, which is the context, which provides aspects such as the context, motivation, and philosophical foundation. And then part 4 is the conclusion, where I propose my expected outcomes and contribution. So diving straight into the presentation in that of part 1 of the context. And here I try and explain the global context and rationale for this study. Critical minerals, as we all know, to meet most sustainable development scenarios far exceeds current supplies. And that's something like 5 times for lithium, 10 times for copper, etc. Africa hosts over 30%, perhaps more, of potential critical mineral supply. And here is the next 2 bullets are 2 of the most critical bullets and form the foundation of my study. 60% of these mineral discoveries are made by junior companies, and junior companies are defined as those companies which are listed sub $100 million and are typically involved in the exploration and mine development process. They're not miners. And of these, 90% fail before they achieve commercial success. However, if one of these junior companies belongs to one of only 3 integrated mining incubators in the world, the 162 group out of Ireland, the Lundin and Hunter Dickinson group out of Canada, they achieve 0, 0, and 12.5% failure rates, which is very much less than the 90% if they were standalone. And therefore, this research aims to translate these learnings into a Southern African-centered ecosystemic framework linking geological, financial, and social capital to improve junior exploration mining success. So if I revisit my problem statement, objectives, and research aim, my problem statement is there is an absence of a fully integrated junior mineral exploration and development business incubator for juniors in South Africa, Southern Africa. My first objective is to critically evaluate how juniors discover and develop mines. My second is the corollary of this. Why are the shortcomings of juniors, and why do they fail? And then thirdly, why are the 3 integrated mining incubators more successful than standalone juniors? And this culminates in my research aim, which is to develop a conceptual business incubator framework for junior mineral exploration and development for Southern Africa. Going back to my philosophical foundation, and this is vital, and I understand the importance of this in terms of providing a firm or concrete foundation for your thesis. I have a relativist ontology where I see reality as being context dependent, shaped by the perceptions and interactions of the actors in the world in which I live, being entrepreneurs, investors, regulators, and communities. I have an interpretivist and constructivist epistemology, and this is where I see knowledge as being co-created through meaning making between myself as the researcher and the participants. I'm going to be using a qualitative and inductive methodology, and I'm going to be deriving insights from rich contextual evidence gathered through primarily structured and unstructured interviews and secondarily data analysis. And I acknowledge with my axiology and my value bound that my professional experience and reflective stance shape the interpretation. I'm running my 4th junior, and I've been blessed to work for all 3 of the integrated mining incubators, and touch wood, so far the 4 juniors I've worked for have all been able to make commercial success. So together these assumptions form a coherent interpretive paradigm, hopefully ensuring that my worldview, theoretical lens and methodological design remain very tightly aligned, and something which was drummed into me very positively in my first few months at Da Vinci, particularly by Professor Singh, was to ensure the golden thread of the study. So how does this link to the TIPS lens? And this was a very clear directive that came out in the documentation for the doctoral colloquium. My philosophy I've discussed already, and that directly links to the people TIPS lens. My theory, and I'm going to be talking about this in a lot more detail in my literature review, so I'm not going to explain it now, directly links to the technology and innovation lenses. My methodology, how will I study what I'm doing? I've discussed that, and that's directly linked to the systems lens of the TIPS framework. And finally, my methods. What tools will I be using? I've mentioned semi-structured interviews, archival analysis, thematic coding and analysis, and this directly links to the technology and people lens of TIPS. So diving straight into my literature review. The first thing I looked at, which came from Clarissa, were the definitions and generations of incubators. He defines the first generation as being property-based, linked to office space, a second generation, support services and training, a third generation being networked, virtual and sector-specific models. The fourth generation, which has been written about by other authors, is an emerging generation, which looks at integrated digital incubators embedding environmental, social and governance, and particularly important, impact investment principles. The 3 integrated mining incubators, which I'll discuss shortly, actually function as system orchestrators, where they link entrepreneurs, government, academia, financiers and communities together. Well, as they work in this way, 2 other very important management theories come to light. The first one is that of entrepreneurial ecosystems, and that all of the work that I'm looking at the moment is interconnected networks that enable innovation, resource mobilization and venture growth. And network theory is equally vital, because many of these juniors, and the one that I run is no different, are run by single individuals, and therefore relationships are absolutely vital and act as channels for sharing resources, trust and reputation. So if I look at the core theories around business incubation, particularly in the mining space, the foundational one is that of a resource-based view, which looks at unique resources which create your competitive advantage. And these can be defined as some things which are valuable, rare, inimitable, or non-substitutable. 2 obvious ones come to mind. The first one is that of a prospecting or a mining license, and the second one is that of a detailed knowledge of the geology. However, a resource-based view is a static theory, and this needs to be complemented by that of dynamic capabilities. And this looks at how firms modify their resources to respond to changing environments. And an application here is that of adaptive governance and venture scaling. And absolutely vital in this space, and I never heard about these until I actually started my studying, but it absolutely describes the behavior of successful junior entrepreneurs, those of effectuation and bricolage, which basically means making do with what you have and reusing what you have to co-create new futures. So if I step back a moment and look at what are the unique requirements of the mining sector, And this is very important because it forms a foundation for why there are only 3 integrated mining incubators, whereas incubators in other sectors, particularly around pharmaceuticals and technology, are abundant. Well, firstly, the very high technical, particularly geological, funding and commodity pricing uncertainty. It's very difficult to predict. High capital intensity and long gestation. It can easily take you between 10 and 20 years from a discovery to a mine which starts to generate cash flow. And therefore, competitive advantage derives from tacit technical knowledge, data ownership, and deep experience. So overlying this are the constraints, for want of a better word, of ESG, and importantly in the mining industry, something which we call social license to operate, which goes beyond adhering to regulations and laws. And this basically means your incubators must be adaptive. Incubators must also offer risk-sharing finance, technical oversight, and stakeholder alignment to convert all of this uncertainty, which I've mentioned in this slide, into structured learning and commercial success. So if I look at the 3 known integrated mining incubators and I compare that to what is happening in Southern Africa, from a structure perspective, the 162 group is essentially a prospect generator. The Lundin group is a corporate incubator. The Hunter Dickinson group is a venture builder. Those incubators in Southern Africa tend to be very fragmented and mostly associated with universities. The core strengths, these are particularly important. The 162 group is entrepreneurial agility and speed. Lundin group is relational capital, and the Hunter Dickinson group is technical integration. Whereas in Southern Africa, the core strengths are chiefly around grant and more around compliance orientation, which is not particularly helpful if you actually want to build companies. All of the 3 integrated mining incubators look at public IPOs, initial public offerings, or reverse takeovers of a public listing. Whereas in Southern Africa, there is virtually none, but I will call it limited equity participation. The learning cycle could be anything from 3 years or more, but with significant and distinct exit points to allow commercialization. An important point I'd just like to add on to this is that integrated incubators offer a portfolio approach, and that's absolutely vital to distribute risk, share learning, and reallocate resources. So I put the observations of what the 3 integrated incubators are across the world, what's happening in Southern Africa, and the management theories which are relevant to incubation and particularly the mining incubator space. I'd like to propose an initial framework for a junior mining business incubator for Southern Africa. And how this works is a bit like an engine. The core, which is the middle, the darker blue, generates ideas and energy. The middle area are the gears, and these organize and transmit it. And the outer system turns that motion into progress and feedback. So the core engine, which is linked to the TIPS lens of technology and people, is capability orchestration. And the key theories here are around RBV, dynamic capabilities, effectuation, and bricolage. This helps you build flexibility, resourcefulness, and entrepreneurial drive. The middle layer, which is linked to the TIPS lens of innovation, are the incubator mechanisms. And this is the working platform where learning, structured again through dynamic capabilities and organizational learning, shares lessons, capital, portfolio approach very important here, and people across ventures. And finally, the ecosystem interface, as these incubators don't exist in a vacuum, they exist in society in general. And this strengthens relationship, legitimacy, and capital flow through various feedback. And I propose this framework converts the complex theory into a pragmatic framework for capability growth, adaptive learning, and ecosystemic alignment. So drilling this into a bit more detail and how it links to TIPS, the core engine links to technology and people, and essentially one of the most important mechanisms in the core engine is to turn a geological hunch, I think I might have diamonds on my farm, into a formal early stage project. The operational platform uses dynamic capabilities and organizational learning. That's linked to the TIPS lens of innovation. And this makes sure that those lessons, capital and people, are shared effectively across each of the portfolios. And finally, your ecosystem interface, which looks at relational capital, legitimacy, and capital flows, is directly linked to the TIPS lens of systems. And this ensures that what you're doing is aligned within the environment, not just financially, but socially and politically too, particularly because of the importance of the social license to operate. So how is this framework compared to other workers in this field? Well, the first worker to actually describe frameworks for business incubators was Clarissa. I've described his generations of incubators previously, and essentially this was a typology of incubators. It was descriptive and static, and there was very limited attention to capability development. TIS built on that using dynamic capabilities, which are chiefly around sensing, seizing, and reconfiguring assets, but this was theoretical and had very weak ecosystem linkage. And then there's the framework which I've put together, which is a 3-layer TIPS-aligned framework with a core engine, operational platform, and ecosystem interface. The limitation, of course, is that this is a preliminary framework derived from the literature, which will be tested as I go through the research phase. So what are the key research gaps and shortcomings? And I think this would be self-evidential from what I've mentioned so far. Firstly, there are very few models explaining mining-specific integrated incubation, or very few frameworks. Incubation systems in Southern Africa are fragmented and underdeveloped, and they typically focus on maybe one thing, compliance or a piece of technology. There's no comprehensive analysis of what makes mining incubators work. So why do the 3 mining incubators, which have a 0, 0, and a 12.5% failure rate compared to an industry-wide failure rate of 90%, work that way? Fourthly, and I'm quite stunned with this one, is there's a very weak connection between entrepreneurship theory and mining practice. A lot is written about mining in corporates, but very little is written about how do you build and develop mining companies. And this obviously leads on to the final point, a lack of long-term and system-level studies in this area. So therefore, I hope that this study addresses these shortcomings by deriving a locally grounded, empirically tested framework for integrated junior mining in Southern Africa. So moving on to my research methodology, it is that of a qualitative multi-case research. My units of analysis are the 3 mining incubators and serial mining entrepreneurs. I'm going to be using semi-structured interviews and archival filings, primary and secondary. And then I'm going to be looking at generalizing theoretical patterns across diverse cases to look for context-specific themes. So how do I connect my research questions to my methods and expected outcomes? You've already seen my research questions in section 1 of this presentation. That research question 1 directly links to qualitative multiple case analysis of successful and unsuccessful juniors. And here I'll be able to identify strategic, organizational, and contextual enablers of success. My comparative thematic analysis will help to lead to a development of a failure typology. So it's the corollary of the first one, is why do so many companies actually fail? And thirdly, and most importantly, a cross-case comparative analysis where I apply the management theories which I've researched in this literature review to deliver a final conceptual business incubator grounded in our realities here in Southern Africa, but linked to global theories on this basis. So how am I going to select and engage the purposeful participants? These are going to be founders and executives with 2 or more commercial junior venture outcomes. And those of you who were not in my proposal might be quite surprised to see that I've only been able to identify 12, which is not necessarily surprising because 90% fail. So only 12 living participants have had 2 or more successes. I'm obviously going to try and capture contrasting national, cultural, institutional, and capability contexts, and ethical recruitment will obviously be as per Da Vinci protocols. Collecting and analyzing my data through thematic triangulation. My primary method I've stated already. My secondary data method I'm going to be using to triangulate the data which derives from the primary method. My secondary data is obviously going to be archival records, company filings, and public documentation. And between the dialogue between myself as the scholar/practitioner, but being very aware of that, to try and interpret lived experiences as to why many failed and some succeeded. I'll be using thematic coding to identify recurring patterns, and I'm going to be verifying this through peer debriefing. So how am I going to ensure ethical integrity and research credibility? I think one of the most important points of this is almost the last point, is that most of the people who I will be talking to, just like myself, are bound by stock exchange and company law and regulations, which goes far beyond often various ethical considerations. So that's a very, very important point. Ethical clearance is obviously vital as it's part of the Da Vinci process, and informed consent too. I don't know how much will be anonymous. I doubt very, very little. And I equally doubt confidentiality will be required, except maybe in certain specific cases. Reflexivity is absolutely vital because I have to acknowledge my own role and my own interpretive influence in this overall process. So, ladies and gentlemen, Doctors Isaac, Masindi, Mgwenya, and Tosin, I'd now like to conclude with a few thoughts. So how am I going to demonstrate the theoretical and practical contribution of this study? Firstly, from a theoretical perspective, by extending incubation theory, by integrating organizational learning and network perspectives into an RBV-DC effectuation bricolage synthesis, particularly for junior mining and exploration in Southern Africa. From an empirical perspective, to compare this integrated frameworks between global and Southern Africa models. And the two most important things, and this talks to one of the reasons why I'm doing this, and I'm doing this almost as a legacy, as I spent 20 years in corporate exploration and mine development, and the last 20 years running juniors. So I want to leave almost like a legacy blueprint for how you can improve things, particularly for Southern Africa. So that's my practical side, a blueprint for sector-specific incubation in Southern Africa. So what will this lead for society? Economic growth, contribution to sustainable development scenarios, employment, inclusive ownership, and local skill development. Just for interest, even a medium-sized mine will have an employment of and a knock-on employment of over 10,000 people. Taxes and royalties in Southern Africa typically amount to between 30 and 50%. So it generates significant amount to the fiscus. And a local skill development thing is really, really important and something that I'm passionate about. I'm not passionate about regulatory 26% BEE, but I am passionate about local mining entrepreneurs owning 100% of these kind of businesses and being empowered to actually do so. So hopefully this bridges theory and practice and advances mining entrepreneurship, scholarship, and hopefully, and this is how I will almost measure the success of this, leads to greater junior success and greater economic contribution in the region. So my next steps, doctors, ladies and gentlemen, is obviously to pass this doctoral colloquium, and I'm sure I'll hear from you in good time on that. Following that, I'll update whatever I need to update. submit and receive ethical clearance, and then crack on with conducting pilot interviews, main data collection, thematic analysis, and draft results. And these timelines were pretty much what I put in my proposal when I initially presented that. So thank you very much indeed for your time. And Dr. Isaacs, I hand the floor back to you.